Oh, yeah.
All right. On Wednesday, January 5, 2022, if all goes well, 4 of us will be traveling to northern Israel to visit the Tel Hazor. We've got a map here. Up in northern Israel, Tel Hazor. I'll zoom in a little bit to see closer. Tel Hazor, which is about 9 miles north of Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. And then we'll drive another 15 miles up to the city of Dan. Both of those are Old Testament cities. And that's the northernmost city in the biblical kingdom of Israel. There we'll see some excavations and go to one of the headwaters of the Jordan River. And then from there, we'll take a short drive. It's like 3 miles over to Caesarea Philippi, which is where Jesus asked, who do you think I am? And Peter said, well, you are the Christ. From Caesarea Philippi, then we will, let's see, I can annotate here. The mouse. From Caesarea Philippi, we will travel to a mountain called Har Benthal. Har is just their name for mountain. And we get an overlook of the area. From there, we travel back toward the Sea of Galilee, toward our hotel, which will be near the Sea of Galilee. But on the way, we will stop at a place called Caesarea, which is a 6th century synagogue and a village where they describe what life was like in the 6th century. So we'll look at Tel Hazor first. It's spelled Hazor, but it's pronounced with a T, Hazor, an Old Testament city. And it was a large city before the Israelites moved to the land. Joshua 11 describes the conquest. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, when he heard of the Israelites were starting to take over the land, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Aksaph, I don't know where they are, and to the northern kings who were in the mountains, to the Arabah, the south of Kinnereth, that's the Jordan River Valley, to the Canaanites, far and wide. He sent word to all of them. He says, let's band together and fight this enemy. So they all came out with their troops and horses, Joshua tells us, and God tells Joshua, don't be worried about it. I will give you victory. So verse 7, Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom. That is in the valley or the marshlands north of the Sea of Galilee, and attacked them. The Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, which is like on the coast, a long way, Mesreph Maim, into the valley of Mizpah, until no survivors were left. Verse 10, at that time Joshua turned back and captured Hazor, put its king to the sword. Hazor had been the head of all these kingdoms. Everyone in it they killed. They destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed, and they burned Hazor itself. Now, Hazor enters the story again in the book of Judges, chapter 4. Judges, chapter 4. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord now that Ehud was dead. So we don't know how long this is after the first conquest. Might have been a couple hundred years. It's hard to figure out dates in the book of Judges. So it says, the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. He let them be oppressed by this Canaanite king in Hazor. And Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth. Anyway, they had a battle, defeated Sisera, but it doesn't tell us what happened to Hazor. Archaeologically, we can say, well, it looks like there was another destruction of Hazor. But the book of Judges doesn't happen to tell us about that. Anyway, we hear of Hazor again in the time of King Solomon, just a brief mention. Here's the account of the forced labor that King Solomon conscripted from his own people to build the Lord's temple, his own palace, the terraces. So these are some of the building projects that Solomon had, is the terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And the last mention in the scripture is a couple centuries later in 2 Kings 15 and verse 29. At that time, Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and took Aijan, Abel Beth Maacah, Jonah, Kadesh, and Hazor. So this was another military conquest. He took Gilead and Galilee, including all the land of Naphtali, and deported the people to Assyria. So this was a conquest by the king of Assyria, taking it over from the Israelites. And kind of the summary of all those is that not much happened in Hazor, biblically, except for military stuff. But as I mentioned, it is the largest archaeological site in Israel. And it may have been the largest Canaanite city before the Israelite conquest. And if we look at the map, we could go back to that map, we could see why the city was militarily important. First, it was on the international trade route. The trade route went through Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi wasn't a city back then, but it went through the city of Dan, and then south along this red road through Hazor to the Sea of Galilee. So that was the hills on the west. You can see the mountainous terrain on the west, and there were marshes on the east. It forced all the travel to go right past Hazor. And all the east-west traffic had to go near this, there was only one decent place to cross the River Jordan, and that's this little place called Bridge of Jacob's Daughters. The river south of that is in a steep canyon, and it's not a good place to build a road or ford the river. So all the east-west traffic had to go near there as well. And third reason is the area was good farmland. It was fertile soil, so it was a rich city. But now we can go down and see what it looks like today. This is from Google Maps, Google Street View. It looks like a mound of earth, just a flat-topped hill. And there are hundreds of these flat-topped hills in the Middle East. They're called tells. Ancient cities are founded on mounds of earth. And when people dig into hills like this, they find different layers of cities. One city built on top of the other, like a layer cake. This is my representation of the kind of layers they might find. That the oldest city is on the bottom, kind of a Stone Age city. Then they might find a Copper Age city. As the technology goes along, then that's reflected in the layers of the city. Of course, you can have two different layers, both in the Bronze Age. They just happen to get destroyed at different times, but all within the Bronze Age. Tel Hazor has 20 different layers. So it's been destroyed and rebuilt 20 different times. But nobody back then started out by saying, let's create a big mound for our city. They all started on flat land, maybe a small rise, and they gradually built their way upward. It took centuries to do that. And in the first layer, they might have had a few houses made out of mud brick. They built a stone wall around the city maybe. And at the beginning, they didn't have iron tools. They didn't have very good tools for shaping stones. So they had to use stones the way they found them, and they would fill in the cracks with smaller stones and mud. Now, this kind of wall isn't very strong, and battering rams can make it crumble pretty easily. So the people in the city would put a lot of dirt on the outside of the wall. So they'd make a steep slope to make it harder for the enemy to use a battering ram, or make it harder to use ladders to climb the wall. And so they might cover the wall with these layers of dirt, puts them on the inside of the wall. It'd have a layer of dirt too, so they could stand on it to give them a little more height over the attacking enemy. So it'd be easier to fight off any climbers. Well, eventually the enemy came, an earthquake came, and it knocked down the walls and the houses. So you end up something like that. The place was a field of rubble. But it's not easy to find a good place to build a city, so the people would rebuild their city in the same place. They'd use many of the same stones again, but there was usually this layer of broken bricks and pottery underneath, dirt and other stuff. So the new surface level might be a foot higher than it was before. And so they built again, maybe making their city walls a little higher, a bit thicker, bringing in more dirt. Sometimes they used the old foundation stones. Sometimes they built in new places. Now, about every 100 years or so, on average, there'd be another earthquake or a military destruction. And the cycle would begin again, and the mound would then get a little taller. Now, as Jillian mentioned last week, Tel Megiddo has 26 layers. Tel Hazor, which we look at today, has 20 layers of destruction and rebuilding over the span of 1,500 years. Now, these tells developed in places where people used building materials that didn't decompose, stones and mud brick. If they built mostly out of wood, then the wood would decompose and you wouldn't build up the layers in quite the same way. So anyway, that's why the Middle East has a lot of these tells, because the people built with stones or mud brick. Iraq has a lot of tells made out of mud brick. Oops, well. Now I lost a slide somewhere in there. Oh, well, I had an aerial view of the park with a few places labeled. And the Tel Hazor is actually two different tells. There's one of them large and very spread out and low. It's basically an agricultural field today. Archaeologists are so busy working different archaeological sites that they haven't had time to investigate everything that's worth investigating. So they've just done a few exploratory things in the lower tell, but they've done a lot more work in the taller tell, the upper city. The upper city is where they expect to find more interesting stuff. The temples were usually on the higher places. Palaces would be on the upper city. Military installations would be bigger on the upper city. So that's where they find more interesting archaeological results.
Mike, where are you going for the excavation?
This is Tel Hazor in northern Israel.
But this is where you're going?
Yes.
Yes. To see the excavation that being done?
Yeah, well, yeah, they probably won't be working at the time we are there. We'll just see their results. Since we're going in rainy season, that's not the best time for them to do their work. The best time is summers. Most of the work is done in summers, even though it's terribly hot. That is when they can get the most cheap labor. College students who are in archaeology classes will come and help do the excavations.
If you were by chance to find an artifact, can you keep it?
No.
No.
They would throw you in jail or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, because well, some of them, like sometimes people find, and a few, rarely they'll find a cache of gold coins. No,
really?
No way you can keep that. They don't even want you keeping a scrap of pottery. You can go, because it's all part of a scientific investigation of what the city was. And that pottery is, for the archaeologist, it's part of the clues that they have for what life was like in the city back then, what time period that particular layer was at. So all of everything they dig up is part of the evidence that they need to sift and examine. Now, you can buy some old artifacts legitimately, and there are also some on the black market, things that have been excavated illegally. where there's so many potential archaeological sites that they can't guard them all. So there's some illegal archaeological work going on because people will pay big money for artifacts. So no, we won't be able to keep any.
Okay.
So it's like going to a national park and taking around a rock. They don't even want you to take a pine. They don't want you to take a pine cone. Nothing.
Nope.
All right. Now, the picture I have here is a Canaanite palace. This dates from before the time the Israelites moved in there, about the 14th century BC, about the time of Abraham. And this palace is partly made out of mud brick. So the Israelis built a roof over it. They're trying to protect the mud. This is just dried mud. It's not fired in a kiln or anything like that. So rain would deteriorate it pretty quickly. And that's in northern Israel, so they do get a fair amount of rain. And it's interesting. This is a palace, and the monarch of the time was living in mud house. And it's just a different. This is upper class living in a mud house. But I guess his mud house was nicer than everybody else's mud house. But in here we can see remnants of walls and floors. In the center you can see some steps. They were made out of stone, and a couple of large pillars on each side of the step that might have been could have been ornamental, or they could have been to help hold up a roof. Next, this is another view of that as well. This area shows a gate of the upper city.
Part of our hose is up on the chair.
Now this gate has 3 rooms on each side of it.
The hose? It's on top of the chair.
And you can see it's made out of stone. It was built at a later time period. They're out of the era of mud brick and into more stones. And the archaeologists find it here because the gate has 3 kind of compartments, or 3 rooms on each side of it, dated to about the 10th century BC, about the time of Solomon. And one of the ways they date these different layers is by architectural styles, by pottery styles, occasional coins, and comparison with other sites. Pottery styles seem to have been, traveled the country pretty rapidly. As soon as one area came up with an innovation in pottery, it was, it wouldn't take, 10 years for that kind of style to show up in other archaeological sites around the country. People saw an innovation and they copied it. So that can help date the different layers. And pottery is a great thing because everybody used it. It broke and it didn't rot. So it just stays in the layers, and it's easy to they dig it up and they can learn something from that. But here, this triple gate was about from the time of Solomon. And we saw earlier in 1 Kings that Solomon had forced some of the Israelites to work in Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And it so happens that gates with 3 rooms on each side have been discovered in each of those places. It suggests that the same architect, or at least the same plan, was at work in those places at roughly the same time. And these 3 cities served as fortifications for the kingdom in Solomon's day. Hazor and Gezer were on the international trade route, but Megiddo was. Gezer was on the road that went up to Jerusalem, so it helped guard the city of Jerusalem. About the same time period, they also developed a different method of building their city walls. This is called a casemate wall, where they have a big cavity in the center. And those cavities in the center would be filled with dirt. If a battering ram was able to get through the first layer of rocks, then there would be a lot of dirt behind it, and the whole wall didn't totally collapse. So the debris made it hard for the battering ram to get to the second wall. This was they did use battering rams sometimes, but sometimes the easiest way was to try to use ladders to get over the wall, because the wall technology was better than the battering ram technology. This archaeological site also has a couple of buildings that were discovered actually above the Canaanite palace, but they relocated these buildings so that they could work on the palace. So they picked up all the, carefully, took pictures of where all these stones were and picked them up and moved them over to another place and tried to arrange them exactly the way they were before, just in a different place. And that's so that we can see what they're like. This building, they figure, was a storeroom. The rows of pillars down the center, they used these pillars because they didn't have long pieces of lumber to use as roof beams. They had to use short pieces. The columns would hold up the ends of the short roof beams. And they figured that people would bring their donkeys or their carts in through the center aisle and then offload to the left or the right into different rooms on the left and the right. Now this made it, it was an efficient use of storage space, but it was also an efficient way for the king to make sure that he got his share of the crop, his taxes. Everybody had to bring their crops in to one building, and then he could control what went in, and he could control what went out in times of need. And a similar construction was used for Israelite houses. This is usually called a 4-room house, though I might call it 3 rooms and a courtyard. But the archaeologists have called it a 4-room house. There's be a flat roof over the side rooms and the back room, but the roof would be made out of branches and then mud mixed with grasses to help hold it together. At the west end of Hazor is what they call a citadel, as maybe a lookout tower, some barracks perhaps, but it's apparently some kind of military installation that dates from the time of Ahab, king of Israel in the 8th century. Also dating from about the same time period is a deep pit dug 150 feet down through various layers. They were doing their own archaeology work at the time, it looks like, but they're exposing all these different layers. But then they were going down to bedrock, and then they tunneled in the bedrock another 80 feet to get to the water table. And in this way, they could have a supply of water even when the city was being besieged. So the Assyrians did come and besiege the city, but the Assyrians came anyway. They destroyed the city in 732 BC, and that was pretty much the end of it. They did not rebuild after that, after the Assyrians destroyed it. And so it was kind of lost. It was just a flat-topped mound of dirt for a long time, and people didn't really realize what was under there. The next place we'll be going is called Tel Dan. Oops, that's the tunnel into the bedrock. And in the back, you can see some the superstructure where they built a stairway for people to go down. So we'll be going further. This Tel Dan in the distance here, and in the far distance, you can see Mount Hermon, the largest mountain in Israel, elevation 9,000 some feet. And it has snow a good part of the year. They do have a ski area up there, but we're not going to the top of Mount Hermon, but we'll be able to see it well. we hope, if it's not raining the whole time. So if we go a little closer, oops, go back. This is Tel Dan. It's not quite as tall of a mound as Hazor is. But you can see from the picture, it's a well-watered area. There are lots of trees and farmland. This is northern Israel, where they get a good amount of rain. And most of the land is flat, fertile, good for farming. They've got a good abundant rainfall and abundant irrigation water as well. So they've got both. And this is where the nation of Israel still gets most of its water from up here.
What do they grow there?
Oh, about everything they grow here too. It's foods. Or they have orchards, wheat, corn. It's just vegetables. Yeah, and everything. Pretty much everything grows pretty well there. It is fertile soil. And like the city of Hazor, the city of Dan existed before the Israelites got there. The book of Judges tells us how the Israelites got there. Judges 18, the tribe of Danites was seeking a place of their own where they might settle, because they had not yet come into an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. They had been allotted some area on the coast, but they were not able to conquer the Philistines there. So they were just kind of stuck with no place to live. So verse 2, the Danites sent 5 of their leading men to spy out the land and explore it. And they said, sent these spies out, go explore the land. So the 5 men left and came to Laish, where they saw that the people there were living in safety like the Sidonians, at peace and secure. Since their land lacked nothing, they were prosperous. They lived a long way from the Sidonians and had no relationship with anyone else. So they thought, well, they're kind of defenseless. So these 600 men, they armed themselves for battle, went out from where they were, and they took, it's interesting, the book of Judges describes how the Israelites did so many different things wrong. They were involved in idolatry. It was the grandson of Moses, or well, a descendant of Moses, probably not a grandson, but he had made an idol, and so the Danites stole this idol and this priest, and they went on to Laish against a people at peace and secure. They attacked him with the sword and burned down their city. So the Danites rebuilt the city and settled there. They named it Dan, after their ancestor Dan. So the city used to be called Laish, and there the Danites set up for themselves this idol and this descendant of Moses as priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity, until the time that the Assyrians came and took over. So this area of Dan was really involved in idolatry for hundreds of years. They were never really worshiping the true God at Jerusalem. It was several hundred years later, after the kingdom of Solomon was kind of split in two. The northern tribes of Israel split off and said, we want to be our own kingdom. They made it the kingdom of Israel. And so the king of Israel then made 2 golden calves. And he said he didn't want the people to go to Jerusalem, because that was his enemy, his rival. He wanted them to stay in his own kingdom and keep all their worship and all their offerings within Israel. So he said, oh, you don't have to go up to Jerusalem. Your gods are right here. These are the ones who brought you up out of Egypt. He set one up in Bethel and the other in Dan. This was Bethel was at the southern part of his kingdom, and Dan was at the northern end of his kingdom. So he wanted to make sure that everybody in his kingdom could go to one of these sites and worship at an area that he controlled. But that was part of the split in the nation of Israel. So now here's an aerial view showing some of the things that we will see on our tour. First, we'll look at the Canaanite Gate. That's the oldest, dating from about 2000 BC. That's the time of Abraham. Yeah. And this one is also made out of mud bricks. And they built a roof over it to protect the mud bricks from the rain. And this is the oldest, one of the oldest examples that archaeologists have found anywhere of an arch. This is when the archway was invented, rather than having two pillars and a lintel, one stone crossing from one pillar to the other. You had to have a big stone for that. So at some point, about 2000 BC, they invented the idea of an archway where you can angle the stone and have gravity hold the stones together. And this is the oldest archway that is still intact. They have found one that's older, but it has since collapsed. And at least in this picture, they left all the dirt in the archway because they didn't want it to collapse. Later, they did kind of tunnel in there and build a wooden support for it. You made a doorway through there just to make sure they could get to the other side and see what was there as well. But this gives some idea of what the fortifications were like back 2,000 years ago. They had enough stones for the walkway to build a road, but they hadn't yet gotten the idea of building their walls out of the stones, because you can see the shape of the stones. It's kind of difficult to stack those because they're rounded. They don't stack that well. They didn't have the strong enough tools to shape the stones. So that's why they used mud bricks, dried mud. Now later, this is a gateway, at least the foundation of the gateway from the time of the Israelites. This one has 2 chambers on each side. Solomon's had 3, but this one only had 2. And those, in a time of peace, those chambers on each side of the gate would be good places to meet people. You could do business at the city gate. In times of war, they would be good places for soldiers to hide. And if anybody tried to come in through the gateway, then they could kind of ambush them from these little rooms on each side of the gate. So it was it made the gateway a more difficult area for enemy soldiers to go in through. And rather than try to batter down the wooden gate and try to go in through these ambush areas, they usually found it easier to try to scale the wall. The walls were not as heavily defended as the gateways were. And once people got inside the gate, they might see something like this. This is a plaza, and have a little platform there. Oops, that's, I think somewhere, that's no, I've lost. And it's in there. Often the king or a judge would be sitting there just inside of the gate, sitting on a platform, covered with some kind of canopy for shade. But that's where he would exercise rule over the people. People would come to ask him to adjudicate their difficulties or to pay their taxes or whatever else it might be. That he was a visible presence as they came into the city. Okay. Now this is the temple area. The stonework here is quite advanced. They have shaped their stones to be nice rectangles, nice well-shaped blocks. This is probably from a few centuries later, the time of Ahab, when they had iron tools to do all this work.
Excuse me. Am I the only one that's still seeing Dan? I'm not seeing any of I didn't see the archway or the gateway.
Oh. I don't know. Can anybody else see this? I don't know, to see the slides changing now?
Yes, I've been seeing them change.
Okay.
For some reason, they're not changing on my
Oh, sounds like yours froze. Well, must
Okay.
be- yeah, too bad. Yeah, you can watch it on YouTube.
Okay.
All right. This is the temple area with the shaped stones. And this steel structure in the middle shows you this where the altar would have been and the size of that altar. It's a bit hard to see how big that was. So this is another picture that shows a man standing there next to it. This altar is actually quite big, it's like 12 feet tall, 10 or 12 feet tall. And the steps you see in the background would have been only part of the steps that they would have needed to go up to the top of this altar to make their sacrifices. Now this area, let's see, the statue of the god was probably on this platform over on the right. Now this is probably the same place that the Danites had their statue, but whenever the king of Israel first set up this site, and whenever Ahab was enlarging the city, they both probably made improvements to the same temple area at the same location. So perhaps underneath this nice stonework from the time of Ahab, there might be a less technologically advanced foundation underneath it. They don't know yet, because they don't want to just dig this up because they don't want to destroy it. It's such a good thing. They've got plenty of other things to dig up, so they don't want to ruin some perfectly good area just to find out what's underneath it. They do have some ground penetrating radar that archaeologists are using now that lets them kind of guess what's underneath things in a less invasive way. But I'm not sure how much they have used it around here or how well it works in a stony area. I know that works well like in England, where they have lots of dirt, and the radar can distinguish between rows of stones and dirt. But here, everything is stone, and the radar may not work so well. One interesting thing they found at Dan is an inscription in ancient Aramaic. It mentions the house of David. Those are the letters shown in white here. This was a monument set up by an Aramaic king celebrating his victory over the northern Israelites and the southern Jews. That might be 2 Kings 8, king of Judah and the king of Israel worked together against the king of Aram, and they lost the battle. So this king of Aram may have set up this monument to celebrate his victory over them in the area of Dan. Now this inscription was so important that they didn't leave it in Dan. They took it to Jerusalem to be in the Israel Museum. This is one of the earliest archaeological evidences of the existence of King David. One last feature of Tel Dan National Park is a series of springs that feed this largest tributary of the Jordan River. It produces about 2,000 gallons per second. It's a lot of water. And feeds the Dan River, one of the 4 major tributaries that make up the Jordan River. The next place we'll go is a New Testament era city, Caesarea Philippi. That's only 2 or 3 miles east of Dan. It enters the biblical story in Mark 8. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. They weren't actually in the city of Caesarea Philippi, but they were in the villages nearby. And he asked them, "Who do you think I am?" Or "Who do people say I am? Who do you think I am?" And Peter said, "You're the Messiah." So this is generally the area in which Jesus was doing that. This was a Gentile area, and maybe Jesus thought this was a relatively safe place to bring up the idea that he is the Messiah. but he's not the Messiah that most of the Jews were looking for. If he told, earlier in other places, if he had said, I'm the Messiah, the people would have started a rebellion right away. It's all right, you're our king, let's go. But Jesus didn't want to be roped into that kind of thing because that's not the kind of Messiah he was. Well, what do we know about Caesarea Philippi? For one thing, it was a center of pagan worship. The city was at the base of Mount Hermon. Now, you see a big cliff face in the back. That's not Mount Hermon. That's just a cliff in the foothills. Mount Hermon itself is much taller. And a spring flowed out of a cave in the side of a cliff. You can see a cave there in the background. And when Alexander the Great and the Greeks came into this area, then they started using this place as a place of worship for the god Pan, a nature god of wooded areas, a half man, half goat. And just to the right of the cave, they carved some niches into the side of the cliff. Here you can see more of them where they would put some statues. One of the statues was for Pan's father, and one was for his consort. But the big one was for Pan himself. And the whole place, the Greeks called the place Panias, after the god Pan. But when Herod Philip wanted to build his palace there to make it his capital city, he renamed the place Caesarea Philippi. But it also continued to be called Panias as well, and it got the Arabic name Banias. Arabic language doesn't have the P sound, so they used B, Banias. So here's a more aerial view. And as you can see, the water doesn't flow out of the cave anymore. An earthquake in the 1800s caused the water to come out a little bit further away from the cliff. But back when the water flowed out, there was a deep hole in the ground where the water flowed out of, and some thought it was the gateway to hell. I'm not sure if there's good literary evidence about that, but that's part of the legend. And it might have something to do with why Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. It may have been referring to this area, even though he wasn't in the city, they were in the vicinity and they would have been aware of that. So this aerial view shows the cave, shows those niches, but it also shows some foundations of other temples that were built nearby. On the left and right in front of the cave, they built a temple of Augustus. And in the middle there, they had a temple of Zeus. On the right was a temple associated with some kind of tombs and what the literature calls the court of the dancing goats. And they're not exactly sure what that was. They have some wild imaginations of what those dancing goats might have been in the context of pagan worship, but we really don't know for sure. Now, if we back up a little bit, we can see where the springs are now. It's not far away. There's a nice series of pools and small waterfalls that they built. And a little bit downstream, there's some more dramatic waterfalls too. One of the, by volume, the biggest waterfall in Israel. There are some other excavations nearby as well. This is the ruins of a Byzantine church and also of the palace that, I think I might have those turned around. This is the palace. And this is the Byzantine church. Church built, centuries later, and also later abandoned after the Muslim conquest. They destroyed a lot of the Christian churches, and then this one was never rebuilt and was lost for a long time. Yeah, this is more of Herod Philip's palace. You can see a lot of archways in the background, the kind of construction they built there. And they let people walk around in this area. The fourth place we'll go to on this day of the trip is called Har Ben Tal. This is not a biblical site at all. It's just an extinct volcano in the Golan Heights near the border with Syria. It's a scenic view. Here we're on one side, you can overlook and see the crater of an old volcano, but you can also see a way far into Israel itself. On the other side, you can see into Syria. Again, good farmland all around. But there's not much biblical to report there. In the foreground here, you can see some military work. That's the only archaeology that's gone on there, where they've built their foxholes. But it's all, the whole area is controlled by Israel now, so it's not used as a military site anymore. The last place we'll go to is Katsran, which is a kibbutz in Israel, a kind of a modern city, but also in the area of the modern city, there's an archaeological site of this 6th century synagogue, and there's a village. All of this shows is excavated, showing somewhat of what the buildings look like, and they have some displays of reconstructed houses and tools of what people would have used in the day back then. And that's the end of our tour there. We'll go back to our hotel near the Sea of Galilee. Let's see. Any questions or comments about those, the things we'll see there?
You have.
Where's the bathroom?
Huh?
Where's the bathroom?
Was that a question? I didn't hear it.
I was
Yeah.
asking. Wait, my wife's computer's echoing.
Oh.
Thank you, myself. I thought somebody else was talking. Anyways, my question, you mentioned about earthquakes. Is it common really? I mean, we don't hear it much in the Bible. You mentioned the layers, like this is done, and then there's an earthquake, and then after some time there's an earthquake or invasion.
Yeah, I don't know how often they happen, but I mean, it is an area, well, like they have the extinct volcanoes there, and the whole Jordan Valley was created by plates of the earth moving apart from one another. So it's still subject to earthquakes, but how often they are, I do not know. Part of the problem was that with the kind of construction they had with stones, like you see in my background, an earthquake can really do a lot of damage because they're not stacked that well, and because they are heavy, it would cause a lot of a loss of life. To even a mild, what we would call a mild earthquake, could be quite a disaster for them.
Mike, what's the most impressive artifact Israel has? You know?
Probably the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah.
You'll hear about that on a later week when people go to the site of Qumran. They'll probably give you some information about the scrolls as well. That's because they are interesting. There's not only an archaeological site there, but they also have all these literary remains too that give a lot more information and detail about the thinking of the people of the time. The people at Qumran weren't representative of the majority. They were a kind of a very small sect, religious sect, but lots of interesting stuff there. So yeah, stay tuned and you'll get to see more about those later.
I think, didn't they just find some more scrolls?
They find pieces every now and then, yeah. And some of the original scrolls, the first scrolls were found by Arabs, and they went into the black market for a while. And at some point, this black market trade figured out that they could get more money if they tore the scrolls apart than if they sold the whole scroll intact.
Got it.
They got more for each piece. So that was, and some of those have still circulated underground, well, yeah, illegally, and occasionally resurface. But some of them are also, it's such a dry climate in the South that all these writing materials are well preserved. They don't rot easily. That's what happened in Egypt too. A lot of, even when they're written on papyrus, it's just like paper. You'd think the paper would deteriorate, but the humidity in Egypt is so low, and it's just covered by sand. It doesn't rot. They just accidentally dig somewhere, and they accidentally dig into some town's rubbish dump, and they find hundreds of pieces of papyri with writing on them, and it's a great archaeological discovery, just accidentally.
It rains. You mentioned it rains in Israel. So a lot of the building materials, when it comes to archaeological digs, the only thing mostly found are rocks. If they have anything like wood, grass, hat, or, the thing they put on the rooftop, because I noticed most of the relics don't have any roof.
Yeah,
those
right.
are
Yeah,
just-
it's all been leveled. So yeah, and the stones get reused, repurposed in other walls in other places. So they don't know exactly what, they see the foundations, but they don't often know how far. Sometimes they can go up, 6 feet, but often, yeah, and the roof is almost always lacking because it was built out of wood, and the wood would have rotted. Even in fairly dry climates, if they get 4 inches a year, that's still eventually the wood does rot. In some cases, they can figure out where the wood was. If they put a post in the ground, they can see where that wood used to be, and it got filled in with other kinds of dirt later. They can, by noticing subtle differences in the kind of dirt that is there, they can figure out where the post used to be rooted. But yeah, it takes a lot of skill to notice those subtle differences.
My wife was asking me, how is their plumbing there? Restrooms, specifically.
I don't know if they found any of that. Plumbing really didn't come into play until the Roman era, where they, and I know looking at some of the places in Jerusalem, they have, like a sewer underneath the street, but in most places, it must have been latrines on the outside of the city. So that's, and I remember, in some places they'll have a town dump where people would, put all their broken pottery. That's in times of peace. And whenever there was a big, military or earthquake destruction, then all the pottery would get broken in place, and they would find them. In some cases, like in Hazor, they find big jars full of wheat burned. Normally, whenever a military would come in, if they found something like that, well, they would take all the wheat. That was valuable. So this was accidentally burned. Either it was like whether it says that Joshua burned the city with fire, or it may have been just an accidental fire in the city. But in some places it would burn things. But in other times they would take their rubbish outside the city and dump it in one particular place. And that probably could have included their chamber pots and whatever else they used. It was not next to the king's palace.
No tissue paper yet at the time, I guess.
No. But even getting water, that's like in much of the developing world today, getting water is a large chore of the day. They have to go somewhere else to get the water and bring it in.
Welcome to California.
Yeah.
We have aqueducts and pipes. We've learn how to manage pressure.
You
So
mentioned
that's a good thing.
comfort. You mentioned you compare the comfort we have today with the palace, like they live in mud huts, kind of looking the structure and so forth, and how far we have, improved compared to the kings of the olden days. An average person today is so much more comfortable.
That's right. Now, I mentioned that Hazor had, two different tells, one tall and one low. I suspect that the common people lived in the low area, and they probably built more with wood and more of it rotted, and that's why it's not a very big tell. I'll have to ask them about that when I get there. But it is in an area where they get more rainfall and would have had more access to wood for their construction.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it was interesting. I enjoy researching these things. Yeah, find out a little bit more about it. I'm sure I will find it much more interesting to be there. We'll have to have another report when we get back.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. Next week,